Good morrow, lords and ladies, and welcome to Masterpiece Musical Theatre. We have a very special topic for you today, the English madrigal and its effect on the validation of the English vernacular, i.e. common speak, to the important world of arts and literature. What is the madrigal, you might ask? I myself asked that question, and let me tell you, it was pretty difficult to figure it out. There were all these books and words and stuff. But basically what it boils down to is that aside from the music that had been generated prior to the madrigal, which was almost always sacred texts and solitary or harmonic voices, almost all male, and generally, sung by monks or other religious figures to celebrate biblical poetry or sacred texts like the Bible. The English madrigal was using secular poetry for its inspiration and its lyrics, and also it was including multiple melodies that complemented each other. And they were often accompanied by musical instruments for the first time. Now, what made this so special, you wonder? The madrigal was born in Italy in the late 13th century. And true to form, the British didn't catch on for a couple of hundred years. Now, being in the Midwest, we understand how that is. Fashions from, the East and West Coast don't make it here for quite some time. We're still walking around in skinny jeans, and they've adapted the silver jumpsuits in LA. But many of the English composers were not wealthy enough to afford their year abroad, their tour of the continent, as it was called. And so they relied on the information coming back from those wealthier nobles to sort of inspire and get the gist of what the fashion and music and literature was over in Italy. So apparently that took a really, really long time. And by the time it made it to England, it was sort of over in Italy. Who knew? 200 years later. But what was interesting about this for the English patrons was that because those composers in England didn't really have access to the high Italian fashion of writing the madrigal, they were interested in using native texts, secular texts, for their lyrics in these songs. Now imagine if you were a peasant in England. We know that most of the poetry and the literature was written in French or Italian or these far superior languages. English just wasn't good enough. But because the English composers began using the English language, and not only the English language, but common slang, sort of like you and I talk, the commoners were able to relate to this music and understand it for the very first time, because most of those peasants and lower middle classes were not multilingual as the noblemen were. So now, instead of jamming out to, like a Japanese techno band, they get to sing along with Lynyrd Skynyrd, basically. This was huge. This was huge in popularizing the music in the country. And actually, Orlando Gibbons' Silver Swan, he wrote what was basically the first British pop song, known across the country and sung by everyone. And this was sort of a unifying experience for the people of England, that and the drink, of course, which they generally go hand in hand. And it was a unifying experience for the English people, and it was also a big step for the English language. Suddenly it wasn't the ugly little brother or the ugly little duckling. It was beautiful, and it was sufficient to carry the weight of the important poetry and the important music. So it began to not be scoffed upon quite as much.
Of all the pastimes that the Elizabethans enjoyed, and they certainly seem to have devoted a great deal of time to the pursuit of pleasure, one of the most important was making music. The Queen herself set the example. She was an accomplished player of both the lute and the virginals, and everyone was expected to sing. As one gentleman wrote, "Supper being ended, and music books according to custom being brought to the table, the mistress of the house presented me with a part, earnestly requesting me to sing."
And this is just the sort of music book he was talking about. It was printed so that everyone could sit round the table, but at the same time they could all see their own individual musical lines.
Fine necks are ladies, cheap choice they have you, good penny ones, but money cannot move. I keep a fair, but for the fair to view, I beg of may be liberal or law, though all my wares each clash of strong, what is true, what part is true, what part is true, what part is true, though all my wares each clash of strong, what is true, what part is true, what part is true, what part is true.
Now, you're probably wondering, why do I care? Because frankly, all of this is a little dull in hindsight. Even the music, although beautiful, is not exactly what most of us listen to in our free time. But let me ask you something. Do you like to do this? Or, if not that, how many of you have enjoyed doing this? No? Kind of a wallflower? Don't have any moves? How about this band?
Where do they all come from? All alone, where do they all belong?
Hard to imagine, but without the English madrigal, many of these popular musical forms may never have happened. They borrow some of the same framework. They're using secular texts. They're using multiple complementary melodies. They accompany their melodies with a song. And they're incredibly popular, known around the country, and valid as important musical forms across the world. It's hard to get more famous than the Beatles, right? But who would have thought, without this man, none of that may ever have come to be. pretty incredible, isn't it? Hard to imagine that this
Don't you think it lines about some idealistic future? Your heart walking right if you keep tearing out the sutures.
was once the equivalent of this.
Feeding her flock near to the mountainside. Feeding her flock near to the mountainside. The shepherds knew not whither she was gone. But after her lover meant to slide up and down he wandered, 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 up and down he wandered. But she was missing when he found her.
And now that I've taken you on a musical masterpiece theater tour of the wonderful 16th century magical, I hope you'll keep this in mind when purchasing your next iTunes. Maybe throw in a little a cappella. Perhaps some... No, you're right, it's pretty hard to dance to that, but still, it's like a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent to what you'd actually want to buy on YouTube. Or see on YouTube. And this concludes another episode of Masterpiece Musical Theater. Please join us next week when we'll discover the fascinating world of swing.
Now is the month of May, when merry lads are playing. Fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la. Now is the month of May, when merry lads are playing. Fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la. Each with his bonny lass upon the greeny grass.